So at its very simplest, people often talk about pedagogy as being about children and andragogy as being about adults. And that's an oversimplification, but it's not a million miles away from the truth. Certainly by definition, there is a sense in which pedagogy is, by definition, to lead the child, and andragogy, by definition, to lead the man. If you're interested in the Greek etymology, it's all available online. But essentially, this distinction, this difference between pedagogy and andragogy, is based on a body of theoretical work, a body of research, the boundaries of which over the last 30 or 40 years have become somewhat blurred. So if we focus for a moment on pedagogy, pedagogy as an idea is concerned with a sequential development. It comes from development theory, it comes from experiments carried out with young children at school level, particularly the early work of Piaget, working with children at primary school level and younger, kindergarten, and explored the way in which they built knowledge up through a process of recognition, of recall, of analysis, and so on. The intention within a pedagogical framework is that the teacher essentially provides the assistance that the learner actually needs to go through this scaffolding process. So everything is structured in such a way as to assume a degree of control and a degree of sequence. Andragogy as a concept is somewhat different. It suggests, mostly on the basis of work by Malcolm Knowles, although that work itself has much deeper roots, again in educational psychology but also in aspects of social theory, that actually suggests that the learner develops through a process of self-aware interaction, that the individual is aware that they're learning, they have the need to learn, they have a requirement to learn something, and that they learn best when they can then make adaptations and adjustments of whatever experiential learning they encounter and draw that back to prior experience, make decisions for themselves, that they engage with the learning process, and that it isn't sequential, it isn't necessarily linear, it's based on a particular set of conditions, and so everyone's learning requirements are different. So a simple way of distinguishing between these two concepts is to look at them through a number of different lenses. If we look at them from the perspective of the learner, then in pedagogy it's often suggested that the learner is dependent on the tutor for the learning, that the tutor assumes full responsibility, and that the tutor ultimately is evaluating the learning and directing the student to the next step depending on their own performance. As opposed to andragogy, where a learner is self-directed, they have responsibility, and they undertake a degree of self-evaluation of learning, perhaps deciding whether to review a concept again and again and again, or whether to move on to something new. So look at your own practice and ask yourself whether what you do in the classroom is truly pedagogical, truly andragogical, or somewhere in between. Then we can look at the role of learner experience in terms of pedagogy and andragogy. So in pedagogical terms, we might suggest that the learner has very little experience that can be tapped into and is wholly dependent on the tutor, as opposed to an andragogical concept where the learner brings with them experience that's tapped into, and indeed learners themselves become resources for each other. Where there are differences in those experiences, that creates an opportunity for further learning. Diversity in experience is seen as a good thing, not as making a class difficult to teach, but rather as providing opportunities for teaching. And importantly, and we'll come on to this in a moment, experience is something that helps to develop a sense of the learner's self-identity, that if they can identify their experience and articulate their experience as the basis for future learning, that helps them in many ways to learn in a more meaningful sense. We also have a distinction in terms of the individual's readiness to learn between pedagogy and andragogy. In pedagogy, it's often suggested that students need to be told what to learn. Indeed, they might have to be told to learn at all, and that they're actually told how to advance, how to progress. The steps are laid out for them individually, as opposed to an andragogical concept where essentially it's some need of change, some sense that there is a requirement to learn that actually triggers that readiness to learn. And need to know becomes central to that individual's sense of their own identity and their own development. They want to be a particular profession. They want to be a chiropractor, they want to be an accountant, and their need to know is about fulfilling that sense of identity. The individual has the ability to look at gaps in their own knowledge and their own experience and decide where they want to encounter learning. Now again, it would be useful for you to be looking at these differences and saying, how do you teach? Are you teaching in a pedagogical concept, or are you teaching within an andragogical framework? Where are you as a teacher? Where are your learners? Are they waiting to be told? Are they able to identify their gaps and plan their own learning? How does this play out in your personal experience? Then we can look at pedagogy and andragogy through an orientation to learning. So pedagogically, learning is a process of acquiring something that the tutor already has. The tutor's decided what the subject matter is, and the content is sequenced in such a way as to make the subject more understandable within whatever the discipline conventions are, but it's controlled by the teacher. As opposed to in an andragogical idea where the learner actually decides to engage with the learning, must have already deemed it to be relevant in order to want to orientate themselves to that learning, and that they will manage and organise that learning around life and work rather than around the subject matter itself. And finally, the idea that the motivation is different between pedagogy and andragogy, that primary motivation for within the pedagogical framework will be one where essentially there are external pressures, a requirement to go to school, but perhaps also a fear of failure, competition for grades, and so on, as opposed to an andragogical idea of something internal, where there is a strong sense of self-actualization, a strong desire to grow as an individual. And again, I'd ask you to think about your own classrooms, think about your own practice, and ask whether in fact what you're doing is pedagogical or andragogical. Now, one way of summing this up is to look at Malcolm Knowles, who's often thought of as, as I say, the founder of this notion of andragogy, and he identifies 4 dominant themes that within an andragogical framework adults need to be involved in the planning and evaluation of instruction, that their personal experience, including mistakes they've made, is a basis for learning activity, that they are most interested in subjects which are immediately relevant to them, and that adult learning at its best is problem-centered rather than content-orientated. Now, it would be interesting to think about each of those 4 and think about a typical class that you teach and ask whether in fact do those facets of adult learning feature in your classrooms.